Cool. All right, well, thanks everyone for coming along. It's good to see some folks here, and we are going to be running through comic books and how we can convert them to web layouts using kind of modern CSS techniques. What you probably weren't expecting coming along to NDC was a little bit of a comic book history, but this is a bonus. So comics are said to have passed through kind of 4 ages, and each of those ages is known to have something sort of a little bit unique or distinct about it. We were first introduced to the superhero archetype in the golden age of comics, and this was around kind of 1938. And what made it sort of unique or interesting is it's the introduction to characters like Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman. Stepping forward to the Silver Age, the world is kind of recovering from a world war, which understandably caused a lot of readers to mature quite quickly in that time. So those stories weren't cutting it anymore. So instead, writers and everything focused on sort of crime and romance and horror to keep the industry going, effectively helping it to survive through this age. Stepping into the Bronze Age, where many of the heroic archetypes were kind of used, like they'd used up a lot of them, the Bronze Age instead tackled social issues. So bigotry, racism, substance abuse, and in that kind of realm became the focus of those stories. The modern age is kind of a time of redesign and disruption from the web. This is where people started to be able to publish their own comics quite easily. If you've seen something like Penny Arcade or the like, you know, it opened up the comic book world or publishing comics to more than just kind of 2 or 3 major players. Everyone had the opportunity to now. And I think why I kind of focus on comics for this talk, and I think what makes it interesting and absorbing storytelling medium, is that along with the characters, stories, and art styles, is the way that the layout is an integral part of actually telling the story itself. And we're going to explore each of these ages that we've just run through and how it can relate to web layout, specifically using CSS Grid combined with other sort of modern CSS techniques to recreate some really interesting and unique layouts. And it starts a little bit simple in the golden age because the publishing was simple, and it gets a lot more complicated as we go along. Now, everything that I'm going to show here is based on a comic book, and so even though the layouts and everything are comic books, it's worth looking at these through the lens of kind of what you're working on now and thinking about how you can take those techniques and apply them to, you know, whatever it is that you might be doing. And something that I kind of just add on to here is I don't dive too much into responsiveness. I think that's been pretty well covered in a lot of talks, and this is more about kind of creating interesting and unique layouts. And I think the responsiveness you can kind of add on to a little bit later, but I like to sort of touch on that in case anyone's expecting it. Okay, so combined, each of those ages cover approximately 70 years, or a little over 70 years, which is quite a long time to evolve any kind of storytelling medium. By comparison, the web, our industry, is still relatively quite young. HTML is 29 and CSS is 25 years old. So that makes me older than both of them. Not combined, though, which is good, but no judgment if you are. The web is young, so are you. And we've kind of walked through our own ages in that time as well. We started with HTML, so it was simple text, list, anchors to create documents. We then kind of took tables and repurposed them for something that they weren't really meant to be doing, but you know, it worked for a while, and we're nothing if not creative with solutions, so that was good. The first of our comic book crossovers, Flash, came along. It created a really engaging and interactive experience on the web, but at the cost of being proprietary tech and, you know, all the trouble with mobile devices. And we used absolute float. We're kind of in responsive, but I would say transitioning into this idea of intrinsic layout. meaning that, there's so many devices now, like the phones that fold out and fridges or whatever else that you can put a page on, that we can't just rely on breakpoints anymore because there's too many. So we need to more be a bit flowing with the layouts and adapt a bit more than what we kind of have before. So all that in 29 short years, less than half of that of our friends in the comic industry. And it's always been tempting and a fun joke to kind of laugh about how layout on the web, centering is quite difficult, but it's amazing how far we've progressed with layout. So we can appreciate sort of where we are when we know where we have come from before. And so a question that I kind of pose is CSS Grid going to bring into the web into the modern age like comics? And I think that might be the case. So before we jump sort of into the code side of things, I'll introduce myself. My name is Anton. I am from Perth in Western Australia, so it was a decent trip to get here. It's very far, as it turns out. That was by plane. I originally started in graphic design, but switched to front-end development for the kind of majority of my career. And as you know, I'm older than HTML and CSS, but not combined. So that gives you an idea of kind of how long I've been playing around with some of this web stuff. I'm the full stack team lead at Doist, kind of more well known for Todoist, but also for Twist. So that's kind of some of the stuff that I work on day to day. If we're all still using Twitter, you can find me at AntonJB. And perhaps this is a bit superfluous information, but I quite enjoy comic books as well. All right, so now it's time for comics. One of the most impactful comics in the golden age is Action Comics #1. It is known for the first introduction of Superman, which is them holding the car there. Now, they've been through many iterations in their time, but this is where they started. The layout throughout this comic, and many in the golden, and I'm kind of going to throw silver into this as well, is primarily squares and rectangles to display the artwork. As we're going to be focused on layout, let's strip out the artwork and see what we're left with. The pattern was 1 to 3 panels per row staggered throughout the page with a somewhat consistent gap. Somewhat consistent because this is printing in the kind of 1930s. But I think it's a really nice starting point in terms of CSS Grid. And if you've used CSS Grid before, you might think, oh, okay, you would grid template row, repeat, say 3 times with 1 fraction. But if we want to get the staggered layout that we're seeing here, we actually need to take it a little bit further than that. So the way that I calculated the layout, the columns, is figuring out what the smallest possible panel would be, which is the one that says 36 pixels there. Now, these are really accurate values, but we're going to be moving into fraction units, so we're not super worried about what the pixel values are, but if we wanted a really small panel, it would be that one. And then we're going to divide it by the sort of page width, which we know, okay, if we want to recreate this, we're going to have 16 columns. So that gives us the number of columns we want and keeps the same ratio as our printed version. But let's look at that in code. So we have display grid template columns. We repeat 16 times with 1 fraction, and we can be very specific with our grid gap now at 12 pixels. Now, we haven't had to define the grid template rows here because we can rely on what is called the implicit grid. So what that is, we have defined a grid along the top there, but if anything of the panels was to be outside of that, grid has to sort of put it somewhere, and that's where the intrinsic grid comes in. It'll add a new track below, and we can define the size if we want. Grid auto rows, we could set some pixels, but we're happy for the artwork to define that for us. So grid will just keep on adding rows down the page as we go. Each panel can then be put into the comic. So we have panel 1, grid columns spanning 6 across. Panel 2, grid columns spanning 5. Grid knows that panel 1 is already there, so we don't have to be overly specific. We can just say, in you go, And then what have we got left? 5. So if we put panel 3 in there, it will sit into that space, and around we go. So we have started creating a comic layout with only a short amount of code. Right? There wasn't too much to it. The staggering is a nice touch. It helps us to avoid being too symmetrical, giving our layouts a little bit more interest. But I don't think we're probably feeling like superheroes just yet, right? We've just kind of created a grid. The artwork in this was more used to hold it. It wasn't really used as part of the actual story. But if we step ahead now to the Bronze Age, it brings with it a change in how layout could become a part of the story itself. This is Spider-Man 121, released in 1973, and it's considered a really pivotal point in this character's story. And spoiler alert for something in 1973, this is the death of Gwen Stacy, which in most comics, you know, death didn't really mean anything, but at the time it was significant. Now, what's great about the story, along with the art style, the characters, and the moment itself, is the way that the layout is actually integral to the telling of it, right? We're not going to feel that same sense of height and danger if the grid was like the one before. So we have the bridge, and it's really showing that nice height and the fall there as well. So even though that is a really nice moment and part of the storytelling, let's again strip out the images and see what we're left with. The big difference here is the spanning multiple rows. It's one of the areas that Grid has brought with us a truly kind of modern feeling to layout. We couldn't go across multiple directions before. I mean, we'll exclude tables there because we weren't meant to do that, but with Flex or something, you only ever got the one axis to work with. Determining the columns was done as the same way before, so I won't dive into that too much, but if we jump into the code, we have our grid, we're using 23 this time, and we have the 12 pixel gap. Now, with our panels, we can say, panel 1, we're going to span across 9, and then the new part, grid row spanning 3, we have those things on there. We have our 3 things down, grid knows what to do. Panel 2, we can just say, hey, you're just going to go across 7, and we'll be fine. Panel 3 will go across whatever's left. And then panel 4 is going to say span 8 and then span 2 down. And again, grid is powerful enough to know, okay, we've already used up this spot, so you'll be here and we'll span across, right? So we're now working with multiple axes, and we're able to cover a great many of the layouts right through the Bronze Age. Now, next on our journey is Watchmen. Kind of famous for many reasons, but one is that it's considered to have kicked off the modern age of comics. Watchmen, interestingly, adhered to a 9-panel grid throughout the whole time that it was doing it. So it didn't do anything particularly like groundbreaking there. And so it means that what we've created so far would actually cover the entire series. And that's not saying that, we should all swap to 9-panel grids like when we had the 12 grids set up and everything like that, but there are a lot of layout possibilities there. But there was something else that Watchmen did with one of the panels that I thought was interesting and kind of broke out of the box a little bit with some of the other comics. The panel in the middle is the one that we're focusing on, and it's zoomed in there. The artwork is spanning across multiple cells in this thing. It's kind of one image, where typically you would have one image per thing, and that is how it would go. Now, we could just break it into 3 images and put each one of them in there, and we'd be done, right? Nice and quick, and we're finished. But I think there's an advantage to trying to do this as well, to keep it as a single image. So if we were to come back later, as things on the web always are changing, right? We never just leave it and print it and it's done. So it'd be nice and easy to update if we leave it as one image. We don't need to remember the dimensions. And this is one of the areas that we do touch on responsiveness. If we want to change something there, well, it'll be nice and easy for that as well. So we've got a little bit of setup here for our grid, but we're aiming to have the image remain intact and put the gap over the top of it. And this technique works by, we have our comic with some stuff that we've sort of covered already. We have our overlap container, which has the image in there. And we're turning that into a grid as well, spanning it across the whole size. And we're giving it some rows and columns in there, the panel 3. Now, only the direct children of a grid become grid items. With subgrid, though, we can inherit the rows or columns from the parent item. And that's what's happening here, where we say grid template columns subgrid. So inherit might have been a perhaps more useful term there, but inherit is used in other ways in CSS. But let's look at this without the image to kind of get a better idea of what subgrid is doing. So overlap is going to inherit the columns from comic, applying them to itself. So if the columns in the comic were to change size, the parent one with it going down the middle, if we were to add more, overlap would inherit those things. But we're not forced to inherit the entire grid. We can set our own rows in this case. So we can say grid template columns, subgrid, and then grid template rows. We can set our own. And that might be useful if you're, say, putting speech bubbles in there if we're using our comic book example. So putting the graphics back in, now we want to achieve the gap. Because everything in here is now a grid item, we can use a pseudo element because we don't want it to be part of the page. It's just an element there for visual sake. We can use some CSS custom properties to make sure that it has the same grid gap, and you could do the same with the color so that it all, and then we position it over the top, doing that. So, setting the outline property, we've simulated the gap in the grid. And that's ticked our goal of maintaining the image and simulating the grid gap. And then on a mobile screen, for example, if we wanted to drop that out, well, we can do that, say, with a responsive kind of thing, either a container query or media queries. Didn't dive into it too much, though. But this is such a common kind of need for us. I'm going to step out of the world of comics for a little bit. If any time you've kind of hit this thing where you've struggled because you've got that one panel that's got a short novel in it and then other ones are like really short little bits of text, this is going to be a really useful tool for you. If we look at an example from the Todoist website, we translate to kind of 19 languages, so German's always a really good one to use because they have very long words. You're going to hit this trade-off where if you set the height, you're going to have unpredictable moments with the text either getting cut off or overlapping or doing something like that. That's a bad experience for the user because they're not getting all of the information. But conversely, in our second example, if you use min height, okay, well, we sort out the problem of text getting cut off, but now we're going to have marketing and design a bit unhappy at us because none of the buttons are lining up and the things along the bottom. So there's always that trade-off of, well, where do you go? You start guessing with sizes or trying to do something. Subgrid is going to have us covered. So if the middle row here is going to grow, subgrid will inherit the rows, in this example, and they will grow with all of the others. So all three panels will keep in sync with each other while being able to have their own semantic meaning. So each one of them can be in their own div, which gives it that meaning, and we do that. So that's kind of the advantage of using subgrid. But where's the browser support at with subgrid, you might be asking? We're still a little bit in experimental territory here. Firefox actually added it quite a while ago, 2019, the day after I gave a talk saying no one had implemented it yet. And Safari has been doing really well lately as well. It's kind of surprising to see Safari up there and not Chrome, right? So they added it in version 16, and there's 2 there because I was kind of saying that you can use it in iOS or in on the Mac itself, right? Or just Safari. There is some hope here, though. Subgrid was included in Interop 2022, so last year's version of Interop, where browser vendors and other sort of people that participate in kind of aligning browser features made subgrid one of the focuses of that time. Now, 2022 was obviously been and gone, and Chrome's logo is still not up there. But I think we'll see something happen there soon. And once Chrome appears there, I think Subgrid will be one of those really useful tools that it was a shame didn't ship with Grid initially. Before Subgrid is more widely available, it is still possible to get this effect with what is called display contents. We can see that on overlap. Effectively, what that is doing is taking the container out of the DOM. So you can put elements in there, but stylistically, we have said don't affect anything, and they all become a part of the grid on top. The positioning becomes a little bit different because they're now part of the grid there, so we have to really be quite specific with where we're putting them, and we lose semantic meaning. That's the disadvantage here. We have to be way more specific, we can't group them, and we've lost semantic meaning. But if you had to, that's one of the options that's kind of available to you. So it's the next evolution during the modern age of comics where layout gets a little more creative and a little more interesting. We're going to dive back into Spider-Man here just because I like it. It's one of my favourites, and I was like, this is fun, I'll just use things that I enjoy. We started to see a new trend in this age of comics, which was overlapping panels. It gave the artists and storytellers ways of adding little bits of detail to the comic that they could extend the story with. Now, layering in the web is not new. We've had that for a while, but with Grid and these techniques, it's, I would say, much easier and predictable than any of the other previous versions we had. So let's take a look at the code. We have display grid, we have grid template columns, grid template rows. And you might be looking at those values and said, you just said it's easier. You're lying. But I will still commit to my message here that I do think it's easier, and I'll show you why. Because we typically will have the artwork available, say in Figma or whatever it might be, what you can do is draw each of the lines that you are going to have a row on. That's both the start of the row and the bottom of the row. So we know that we're going to need 9 rows in this grid. And we're going to say, okay, the height of that, this might look quite familiar to something we did before, the height of that is 985, divided by 9, that's, if we were to equally break it up, we have 109 pixels. That's going to be our sort of base unit for this. So what we can do to figure out, okay, well, if this one is 291 pixels, if I'm dividing that by 109, I know now, okay, it's 2.6 times what is my base element, and we get 2.6 fraction units. So, okay, I keep using these fraction values. So what are they? Because we have flexibility when we need to make everything responsive and we're going to try and keep the aspect ratio, this is where the fractions really come into play. Hang on a minute, what have I just done there? Yeah, because we have that. And we'll repeat that same thing for the column. So that's where those numbers kind of came from. We have panel 3 here with the lady holding the flower. We can say grid row 4 to 7, grid column 5 spanning to 1, z-index 1 because we want it to sit on the top. And then panel 4, which is kind of the field there, we can say grid row 5 through to 9, and then the grid column we're going to say 2 through to -2. And so the -2 is sort of a standout there. Like, where does that come from? When we're working with grid, each of the lines that we define, in this case, we're still going to look at the columns, is going to be numbered from 1 through to n. N being 8 in this case, but it's the total number of columns that you have. So our starting line for panel 4 with the field is 2. We have 2 in from there. Interestingly, what grid does is also numbers it in reverse, from the right through to the left, -1 through to -8. It's useful that because we got that panel, we know that we're going to be 2 in from there, we can just do that. And why that is good is if we were to add more panels in between 3 and 5, we don't have to adjust this field. It's just going to grow with it and everything will do that. If we add anything outside, then we have to start adjusting. But for most of the time, it's giving us a little bit of safety for when things inevitably change. Handily, most browsers will show you what these numbers are. So if you inspect it in the grid, inspect it in the dev tools, flick on, say, show line numbers, the wording varies between the browser, but it'll be something along the lines of line numbers.
Is there any reason why you wouldn't just put 7, just leave it 2 and 7? Or?
Yeah, so the reason that I wouldn't is when we change something. So someone will come along, oh, we actually want like another thing in the middle. I can't go too far because the camera's going to cut me off. Actually, I've got a handy laser here. So if we put something here to here, but we needed to add another row, if we do that, 7 becomes 8 and 8 becomes 9. We've now got 9 and that one's now off by 1, right? That classic programming thing. If we go from the other way, no effect. It's always going to be that. There is, there's a hole in this in that if you add one between 7 and 8, we've got the same problem. But most of the time, you'll be fine. So a browser's going to show you that. You can go into the dev tools and you can say, show me the line numbers, show me the grid areas. Really great way of, for me, I'm quite visual in the way that I kind of learn and understand things. This is that sort of visual way that I can be like, oh, I get it. Like, this is how it's kind of lays around. So, the modern age made sort of prolific use of this layering. And it can be a great way of breaking outside of the boxes that have contained us in design for so long. This is Hawkeye number 1 and the web recreation next to it. So if we start using some of this layering, but then add our own little outlines to it, we can give some really interesting results and break out of this idea that everything needs to just be kind of in a box. Keeping the theme of my comics, and to quote Uncle Ben, with great power comes great responsibility. Layering is a really exciting addition to our layout toolboxes, but we do have to consider more than just the layout that this is going to open up to us. There's an inherent danger here that when you can position something wherever you like, if the source order of your page doesn't match what's happening, we're going to negatively impact the accessibility of our project. So I keep kind of saying that things always change on the web, right? It's the beauty and the curse of it. So if panel 4, our field, we come along one day and we say, actually, the field is better at the top. We can say, oh, great, we've done this in grid. We can say, move it to 1, span across 5, 1 to -1 there. I did that in the wrong direction, but that's where it's going to go. Solely changing the visual layout does not tell the browser that the source order has changed. And something like a screen reader is only going to pay attention to the source order. It's not going to parse the CSS and say, oh, I see where this panel is doing. So myself, who is going to absorb this visually, I'm getting a story on the right here with the panels and the field there. Someone using, say, assistive technology, they're getting the story on the left. They're getting a different story, and so it's important to keep that in mind when just moving things about the page. So how can we do that and avoid falling into the trap of negatively impacting? We can start with the structure of the page. Make sure that you've put it into the HTML in the order that you would kind of naturally read it. Then we create the CSS grid and the layout that maintains, or that contains it, sorry. And then, like any good superhero, we have to be vigilant and maintain it. If something like that's going to move or change, we need to make sure that we update the source order as well. This article on MDM is quite a good kind of introduction, or not introduction, run through of layout and accessibility there. So it's worth a look for this. I was touching before on a common criticism of the web in that everything is within a box. It's bootstrap layouts is kind of one way that I've heard that talked about. And there's techniques that we've used through this time that have enabled us to be quite efficient at the cost of creativity. And everything we've been looking at has also kind of been very boxy, right? For comics, boxy layouts started to change in the modern age of comics. Characters broke out of their boxes and the storytelling evolved with them. This is a nice example from Phoenix and Jean Grey, and importantly, the web recreation next to it. So it can be done on the web. Now, fundamentally, everything within the grid is still a box. We can't do T-shapes or circles or things like that. It is a box, but we can kind of use some techniques and strategies to get a little bit creative and give the illusion of almost any layout that we like. So there's a little bit of boilerplate that we're going to look at here. This is the container that we have. As always, we've called it comic. We're positioning it relative because we're going to be moving some things around. We're going to have our background and overflow hidden because, like I said, we're moving things and it's all going to blow out the side. So we're just trying to keep it a little bit contained at the moment. The panel has a column for each of our 5 panels. Now, we can only see 2 of them here, but they are all sitting there. We've put them all there. Because they're overlapping with the other images, if we put each one in a grid cell, we're not going to be able to get that overlapping. So each one of them has an area that it's sitting in, but they're casually overlapping each one of them, and it's hard to show on a slide. I'm hoping this will slightly help, but we have them kind of there, and they're just layered on top of each other, roughly in the kind of order that we need. Now, our panels can then be rotated to about where we want it, and we transform it and translate it a little bit. There's different ways of doing transform and translate. This is kind of what I've done with for brevity, but we can position that kind of where we want it. Now is the interesting part. We want to get the shape of the panels that we were talking about, and this is where clip path comes in. So clip path code looks like this. We have our cat, and we're like, okay, cat, we only want to see this part of you. So we can say clip path polygon, and we have an X and a Y value for each one of the nodes that goes along. So 0 to 18, 20 to 20, 78, and we make our way around. We can now apply the clip path to each of our panels, and we're getting most of the way there, right? Now, again, you're probably looking at these values and going, where are you getting these from? Like, this does not look like a fun activity for my day. Some of the browsers are kind of really getting helpful with being a bit more creative. I use Firefox a lot for the development. They had some really good things in this. So if you already apply a clip path to a shape in CSS, save that, open up the browser, there's a little thing next to clip path which you can click, and you can start dragging those nodes around. That's interactive. And if we double click, we get a new node on there, and the CSS has updated. And so we can take those values and take them back to the code. So we jump between a lot when we're trying to get a little bit creative there. But the browser tools can be really helpful here to, again, if you're quite visual, to do that. And I'd be impressed if you could do that without being visual, honestly. But yeah, that's sort of the approach that I've used. Now we want to achieve the white border. Because everything's overlapping, we can't use grid gap because they're going to move in weird ways. So we have the panel, we put the background color of white onto there, and we have the image inside, so we apply the same clip path to it. So we have the same clip path on both the container and the image itself. We transform it and scale it down a little bit because we want some of that border to be visible. And then we transform it, because we've changed everything into funny little shapes, we need to transform it a little bit. But that's kind of the downside of this technique. We can't use the grid as much, so we've got to get a little bit creative with that. And so you'll have to be accurate. But I think the outcome of that is really interesting. We have something that's not a box, that is a creative layout that we wouldn't have thought previously quite possible. And if you haven't seen it yet, underneath each of the examples is a link to CodePen where you can actually have a look and play at these. If you haven't taken a photo, don't panic. At the end, there is a link to the entire collection, so they'll be there. But they are there for that. But It's no doubt a powerful tool when we combine it with Grid. So here's Batman jumping off something. And in the background, we have these squares kind of going down, and none of them are overlapping between each other, but there's a little bit of transparency and the border is flowing with it. And I thought, oh, this will be another interesting use of clip path. So we're going to ignore Batman. We'll just pretend he's already passed by in the layout that we're doing. But again, we can define our grid. We can add the elements to that. We can add, in this case, we're adding some perspective. That gives us that sort of shape to it. A little bit of rotating. We're just moving things around at this point. So the first problem here is, okay, well, we've got that going down. That's fun. But we can see the other panels behind it. Here we can use clip path again. So we can say clip path onto a polygon again, and we're going to trace the parts that we do want visible, not the parts that we don't want. And then we've got kind of a nice effect where each of them is almost having a border that's flowing down. The transparency is there, but none of them are visible behind the other one. And you can see this one being in kind of a hero panel or something like that in a regular website. So there we go. We've got our layout that we've created and Batman's version next to it. And we can get pretty close. This one's wild. We're not limited to just polygons. I really like this cat. It's like become Two-Face. We've covered the polygons. I'm not going to step through this one. But we've covered that we can do polygons already. But we're not limited to that. This is Flash, and there's so much going on with it. And I thought, I wonder if we can do this. And with a little bit of layering that we saw before and a little bit more clip path, we can, of course, recreate that and put some cats in it. So the options that we have is ellipse, which has the radius at the first part, and then the position, kind of the offset there. So if we want a non-circle circle, that's what we have. If we want a circle circle, then we can say there's our radius and also the position there. So we have options. So clip path affected the shape of the element itself, but if we can also have text reacting to the shape of things with CSS shapes. Here we have a panel from Saga, and we have the planet there kind of with its... The text is sort of following that shape of the planet. It provides a little more interest than, say, a square speech bubble that we'd be more used to in comics. Now, this has been fairly common in print. You've likely seen this in magazines, especially when they wrap around something, but absent from the web for a long time. So, what are we doing? We've got our panel, we're relatively positioning it, because again, we're moving some things around. We've got our paragraph, we're pushing it about where we want it. The important part, though, is shape outside, circle similar to the one we had in clip path. And the text will start to react to that. But again, handy, the browsers have us covered. So if you add the shape outside, and you can do whatever circle you like, you can tap that thing there, and you can start to do it in real time. And we can see the text reacting to the shape. We can fine tune it a little bit and say, okay, yep, that's about where I wanted it. And we can copy that and paste it into there. Now, it's really cool that the browsers have this, but marketing's going to come to us and they're going to say, we need the text wrapping a cat's face. And you'll be like, I've seen this done. We can use polygon here as well. The shapes that are available to us in the other ones are all available in CSS shape too. So if you need to get ultra specific one day, there you go. And something that was in... not in clip path, that is in shape outside, is the ability to use alpha masks. So if you have your cat's face, and then you have the alpha mask version of your cat's face, you can do that much like you would a background image and paste it on there. You do have to be careful, there is a cause restriction here, but I don't want to go into cause. If it's on your domain, you'll be okay. Don't start hot linking to other images and you'll probably be all right. So, what we created is a great example of a modern web but it is based very much on Western comics standards and styles, right? That is typically reading left to right for me, top to bottom. But that's not the only comic structure that's available. Japan has the manga sort of comic industry, or that's probably not a great translation, but they have mangas and then they have a different structure to them. Now again, I've been a particular fan of Naruto, so it's fun to just keep using things that I enjoy in this talk. But this is the same page from the manga in Japanese on, I guess, your left, and the English version there. Now, I'm pointing out that this reading starts at the top right and goes to the left, making its way down. And interestingly, in the English version, it stays that way. They don't change the thing, but they do add the English text over it. So we know that we can position cells in a grid however we like. But we know from earlier that we have to consider the source order. So we're not just going to put it in the top right-hand corner and do that. We need to have it in the order that it would be read in the source code. So when placed into a grid and we define it with left to right, what I'm kind of used to is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we put it in our source order that you would naturally read in, and then laid it out in the grid. And there's actually not much more we have to do to support right to left reading, because Grid has really great internationalization support. So you're not typically going to add direction right to left onto it. You would have something at a more global level most likely. But for the purpose of this, we add right to left, and we can say 1, 2, 3. Everything is just naturally moved in the order that we needed it to. And side quest here, the gap is different, just showing that you can actually have the different values for horizontal and vertical in there as well. I've often just written gap as like 16 pixels, but you can do it in there and have a little bit more variation as well. Also worth noting in the manga version is that the text is running vertically, so vertically right to left. And then in English, it is the other way of what we would typically read it. I didn't attempt Japanese here because I didn't know what I would write, but I put English in there, and you can say, with writing mode, you can say vertical right to left. With a logographic character set such as Japanese, it would appear stacked kind of correctly. I'm not sure why in the English one it moves the exclamation point to the front, but it does. There's probably some technical thing. I'm more just showing that it is possible to get that same effect. So that brings us to the end of our journey through the ages of comic books and how they can be brought to the web. I mentioned at the start that although these examples are very comic book focused, to really think about how you can convert these techniques to the stuff that you're working on now. I hope that the various effects demonstrated throughout the talk have kind of sparked some ideas, and I'm really interested to see where people kind of take this beyond comics and into the everyday things that they're working on. We've been in these layout boxes for sort of quite some time now, and I think if you apply these effects to what you're working on, really great things will happen. And that's why I believe we are now hitting the modern age of layout on the web. CSS Grid gave us great powers for how we could stagger our content, layer our panels to create some depth and interest. The coming CSS Grid spec level 2 with subgrid so that we can better position things in there, improve our semantics and our layout. Getting a little more creative and breaking outside of the boxes with clip path and CSS shapes, and making our projects as accessible to as wide an audience as possible with Grid's great internationalization support. If you're interested in the code examples I've been showing, they can all be found at this CodePen collection. Feel free to play around with them, and I think a lot can be gained from looking at the code that you can't do. I'm just going to delay while people take photos. Wet my whistle. I don't see any cameras in there. Oh, quick. No, you got it. Cool. No more cameras. if reading is more your style, each of the sections I've broken into an individual blog post. It gives you a better chance to go a bit deeper than what a talk gives me the opportunity to. I can kind of be at a higher level, but in the blog post I can break it down a little bit more. So yeah, if you like to read about these things, that option is also available to you in kind of each section. Stan Lee had a really famous sign-off, or I don't know if it's famous, but he used it on every letter that he signed off on, which was Excelsior, and I thought, oh, that'd be a fun thing to throw in at the end of my talk on comic books. He's had a big impact on not only comics, but probably a lot of creative industries, really, when you think about it. But then I was like, well, what does that even mean? So I looked it up, and it means ever upward. And I thought, oh, that is a great way to kind of sign off on a thing. Is the idea is that you can take kind of everything that you've learned at this talk and the conference as a whole and take the web and the things that you're doing ever upward. Thanks very much. I think, is that off now?